Welcome to Psycast. What if the hardest part of achieving your goals isn't discipline, but remembering who you are in the moments you forget? Today, I want to explore something powerful: the quiet, invisible shift that happens when we stop forcing our lives forward and instead start building systems that carry us when motivation disappears. This isn't about pushing harder, it's about designing your life in a way that your values walk ahead of you, even when you're tired. There's something deeply exhausting about constantly trying to be better, like you're always one effort away from being enough. One more productive morning, one more perfect routine, one more cleared inbox, and maybe then you'll feel worthy. But here's the truth: I've had to learn the hard way. Goals built only on willpower crumble when life gets heavy. Discipline might carry you through a week, but it's identity that shapes your years. And when the noise quiets down, what's left isn't how hard you pushed, it's who you became along the way. James Clear, the author of Atomic Habits, offers something different. He doesn't start with goals, he starts with identity, because behind every goal is a person you want to become. And that's the part we forget. We chase outcomes, lose 10 pounds, write a book, run a marathon, but the real transformation isn't in the finish line. It's in the quiet, repeated choices that slowly build the kind of person who does those things naturally. The person who identifies as a writer doesn't wait for inspiration to hit. They sit down, even when it's hard, because writing isn't something they do. It's who they are. Clear puts it like this: you do not rise to the level of your goals, you fall to the level of your systems. That stayed with me, because most of us think failing to reach a goal means we didn't want it enough. But what if it just means we didn't build a path for it to walk on? Goals give you direction. Systems keep you moving. And systems aren't glamorous. They're quiet, boring even, showing up when no one's watching, putting on your shoes even when you don't feel like running, writing one paragraph instead of scrolling, choosing the apple instead of the chip. Small acts that echo back, day after day, into a life that feels aligned. But let me tell you something that might bring you comfort. You don't need to overhaul your life overnight. In fact, don't. James Clear speaks of the 1% rule, the idea that if you improve just a tiny bit every day, those small changes compound into remarkable growth. Think of it like compound interest for your habits. One small win, consistently repeated, becomes your new normal. Not because you forced it, but because it became familiar. Habits shape your identity, and identity sustains your habits. It's a loop, a quiet spiral upward. But it begins when you stop trying to achieve and start trying to embody. And maybe the most radical shift is this: trusting that you don't need to fight for the life you want. You need to design for it. Shape your environment, reduce friction, make the good thing easy, make the unhelpful thing harder. You're not lazy. You're not undisciplined. You're just human, responding to cues, incentives, and paths of least resistance. So why not give your brain the path it's already looking for? What if instead of asking, "How can I force myself to do this?" you asked, "How can I make this easier to do?" Systems, not shame. Structure, not struggle. Because the life you want isn't waiting at the end of a goal. It's quietly unfolding in the shape of your days. And maybe no one ever told you this, but you don't have to earn your way into the person you want to be. You become them by starting small, by treating each habit not as a means to an end, but as a quiet vote for your future self. Every time you choose to align your actions with the person you want to be, even just a little, you reinforce that identity. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, you stop trying to change your life and start living as someone who already has. That's the beauty of identity-based habits. You're not running from who you've been. You're anchoring yourself in who you're becoming. Clear writes that every action you take is a vote for the type of person you wish to become. It's not about perfection, it's about direction. And direction, more than intensity, is what shapes a life. Because intensity fades, motivation runs out. But systems stay. When the emotion is gone, and the excitement has passed, your system will be there, quietly catching you, gently nudging you forward, like a current beneath your feet. But let's be honest, This isn't how most of us were taught to grow. We were raised on breakthrough stories and all or nothing plans. Transformation, in the narratives we've inherited, is dramatic. Overnight, loud, but real change, the kind that lasts, it's unglamorous. It's built in the margins, in the micro decisions no one sees, in the moments you choose a glass of water over a third cup of coffee, or walk for 5 minutes instead of skipping movement altogether. It's not that those acts are miraculous, it's that they send a message to your brain, to your identity, to your sense of who you are. One of the hardest shifts I had to make was this, realizing that failure wasn't proof I was broken. It was proof I needed a better system. We blame ourselves when we fall short, but rarely question the structure we're operating in. We say, I'm bad at this, instead of asking, what's making this so hard for me to do consistently? It's not about fault. It's about design. Your brain is built to conserve energy, to favor the familiar, to follow the path of least resistance. So instead of blaming yourself for not climbing the mountain every morning, maybe it's time to ask, how can I make the path gentler? This is where environment plays a quiet but powerful role. Want to read more? Put the book on your pillow. Want to eat better? Chop the vegetables ahead of time. Want to stop checking your phone first thing? Leave it in another room. These aren't grand resolutions. They're micro adjustments that shift the terrain, because you will always default to what's easy. So if you make the good thing easier, you're not resisting yourself. You're working with yourself. That's not laziness. That's wisdom. I think sometimes we're afraid to go slow because we confuse slowness with failure. But there's something holy about steady progress. Something dignified about the person who shows up daily without applause and lays another brick. One choice, one cue, one repetition. Until the habit is no longer something you have to remember. It remembers you. It's embedded. Autopilot doesn't mean you've given up control. It means you've given your values a home inside your routine. And once they live there, you no longer need to fight for them. You live from them. Let me tell you something I once heard and never forgot. You don't rise to the occasion. You fall to the level of your training. And habits, those tiny, invisible patterns, are our training. Not just for performance, but for life. For how we respond when everything feels heavy. For how we stay grounded when nothing goes as planned. Your systems are the scaffolding that hold you together on the days your heart wants to quit. And that's not weakness. That's grace. It's knowing that your future self doesn't need your perfection. They need your preparation. James Clear often talks about how habits are shaped by 4 steps: cue, craving, response, and reward. It's not just behavior. It's a loop. Something in your environment triggers a craving, a desire, conscious or not, which leads to a response, followed by a reward. Understand the loop, and you begin to understand yourself. Change the cue, and the craving shifts. Interrupt the response, and the outcome changes. It's a delicate dance, but it means this. You're not at the mercy of your habits. You're in conversation with them. You can rewrite the steps. And maybe that's the most compassionate truth here. You're not stuck. You're rehearsing. You're living out patterns that were carved for a different version of you in a different chapter with different needs. But you're allowed to edit, to notice when something no longer fits, to create new cues that support the story you're telling now. If every action is a vote for who you're becoming, then your habits are like the quiet campaign of your becoming. No one sees the ballots, but they count. They shape the inner election that decides who leads your days. Fear or clarity, autopilot or intention, reaction or rhythm. And here's the beauty. The more you repeat a behavior, the less effort it takes. Neuroscience calls this automaticity. A behavior becomes second nature. You don't think about brushing your teeth, you just do it. That's where real freedom lives, when the behaviors that once required effort now carry you, like a river with a familiar current. The goal isn't just to build habits, it's to become the kind of person who doesn't have to decide every day, because the decision was already made, through consistency, through design, through the slow shaping of self. I've seen this happen in quiet, tender ways. A woman I know started placing her running shoes by the door every night. At first, she didn't run. She just put them there. That was her habit. The cue. Over time, putting on the shoes didn't feel foreign. It felt expected, natural. One day she walked. Weeks later, she jogged. Now, she runs 3 times a week. Not because she set a bold resolution, but because she let her identity catch up to her behavior, and her behavior catch up to her belief. It wasn't linear. It was layered. She stopped trying to change everything overnight and started building trust with herself, one step at a time. Trust, maybe that's the hidden currency in all of this. We think habit formation is about discipline, but beneath it, it's about rebuilding trust. Can I rely on myself to follow through? Can I count on my actions to reflect what I say I value? And if not, can I meet that gap with curiosity instead of shame? That's what makes systems so powerful. They aren't just tools to reach goals. They're bridges between who you were and who you want to be, between intention and embodiment, between trying harder and becoming wiser. There's something sacred about the small choices no one sees, the ones that don't feel urgent, but quietly reshape your life from the inside out. Like going to bed 30 minutes earlier, drinking a glass of water when you wake up, leaving your phone in another room during dinner. These choices seem too small to matter, but they're not. They are the architecture of who you're becoming. Because every habit you build sends a message. This is the kind of life I'm choosing. This is the kind of person I believe I am becoming. And it's not about being perfect. It's about being in process. One of the most dangerous beliefs we carry is that change has to look dramatic to be real. That unless we post about it, measure it, or celebrate it publicly, it doesn't count. But the most meaningful changes usually don't make a sound. They happen in private, in the 5-minute pause before you react, in the choice to speak kindly to yourself, in the subtle but radical shift from asking, "Why can't I get it together?" to "What would make this easier for me to do today?" That's the quiet revolution. James Clear reminds us that habits don't restrict freedom, they create it. Because once a habit is embedded, it removes the need for constant decision-making. You're not wasting energy deciding whether or not to do the thing, you're just doing it. That frees up mental space, emotional energy, and time. It's like decluttering your inner world. You no longer have to bargain with yourself. Your routine becomes your ally, not a cage, but a rhythm that supports your real values, even when you're tired, stressed, or overwhelmed. This also means that building good habits is less about grand ambition and more about reducing friction. One of the most overlooked truths in behavior change is this: convenience beats motivation. Every time. You're far more likely to eat healthy if the food is already prepped. Far more likely to journal if your notebook is already open on your desk. Far more likely to meditate if your space is quiet and waiting. Your environment doesn't just support your behavior, it shapes it. And when you design your spaces with intention, you begin to feel like your future self isn't so far away. Let me give you another quiet example. A man I worked with wanted to write a novel. For years, he told himself he needed the perfect setup, the right mood, long stretches of time, total focus. But those conditions rarely came. So he changed one thing. He committed to writing just 100 words a day. That was it. Some days, he went beyond. Others, he barely hit the mark, but he never missed a day. And you know what happened? A year later, he had a first draft. Not because he forced a book into existence, but because he showed up for a version of himself who writes. And over time, that version became real. We all carry a vision of who we want to be. But that vision only becomes reality when it meets the consistency of action. Not big, dramatic action, but small, loving, persistent action. The kind you barely notice, but that starts to feel like home. This is how we train the brain. Not by shouting new goals at it, but by gently rewiring what it expects, what it sees, what it repeats. Habits aren't about proving your worth. They're about expressing it. And when your life begins to reflect your inner values, not in words, but in rhythms, you begin to feel something we rarely talk about: alignment. Here's the quiet miracle of systems. One day, you realize you've become the kind of person you once only hoped to be. And you did it without dramatic declarations, without reinventing yourself overnight. You did it by showing up, repeatedly, even when it felt boring, even when no one noticed, especially then, because that's when identity takes root, in the repetition, in the stability, in the sacredness of the ordinary done with care. And I want to say this, because maybe you've never heard it before. You don't have to chase your goals. You can invite them in. You can create a space where they're not something you're grasping for, but something that begins to emerge from who you are becoming, like fruit from a tree that's been rooted, watered, and tended quietly over time. You don't force it, you foster it. And there's a kind of peace that comes from knowing that you no longer need to fight your own nature. You just need to nurture it in the right direction. James Clear's work, at its core, is not about productivity. It's about permission. Permission to go slow, to start small, to trust that consistent, identity-aligned habits will carry you further than bursts of willpower ever could. And maybe most importantly, permission to forgive yourself when you fall out of rhythm. Because the point isn't to be flawless, it's to return, over and over again. To return to the version of you who knows how to begin, who doesn't wait for the mood or the praise or the certainty, who simply begins. And that, I think, is the deeper invitation. To stop living in opposition to yourself, to stop making goals the enemy of peace, and start seeing them as expressions of care. Because the life you want isn't hiding behind discipline. It's waiting inside the small human decisions you make each day. What you reach for when you're tired, what you say to yourself when you fall short, what you do when no one's watching. That's the real work. Not becoming someone else, but remembering who you already are and letting your habits reflect that remembering. So if you're listening to this, wondering where to begin, maybe you already have. Maybe listening itself is a cue, a shift, a small vote. Let that count. Let today be a step, not toward perfection, but toward presence. Not toward an idealized version of yourself, but toward the quiet, steady voice that says, I know who I want to be, and I'm learning how to live like it.